So this is my majorly overdue review on Under the Never Sky by Veronica Rossi. I read this several months ago, so yeah, I'm kind of struggling to remember exactly what my feelings were really, but I remember that I enjoyed it well enough. I didn't think it was brilliant or anything, and it obviously didn't leave any major lasting impressions on me, but while reading it I recall thinking, no, this is okay, this is half decent. I like that it was like kind of touted as being dystopian, and it is, but it's also sci-fi and there are some fantasy elements in there, and just because that tends to be the dealio with a lot of Australian fantasy novels that I grew up on, particularly the Albert Newton series, I'm used to the mishmash of these genres and subgenres together, so I quite appreciated that it wasn't just a dystopian or just a sci-fi, and the elements combined pretty well, I think, and pretty effectively, in my opinion. So, it's also a book told in, from dual perspective, dual narration, so we've got Arya, who's I'm assuming is the lass on the cover here, although what she's wearing is not at all credible for what she wears in the book, because she'd be real cold. That's Arya, and she comes from under the Reverie, which is a domed, enclosed city, and no one goes outside of Reverie because outside is the Never Sky, and it's all dangerous out there. They call it the Death Shop, and if you go out there, it's all like vast landscape and desert and things, and this like ether sky that's always got storms going on and stuff, so it is very dangerous to go outside, and savages live out there, and the savages are uncivilized and uncultured, and they'll kill you and eat you and stuff. And within Reverie, there's an awful lot. It's like very controlled and very isolated, segregated sections for everything. Computers play a large role in what you do. You have like your eye patch. Everyone wears an eye patch, and so half of what the life they live is like virtual, because they go into kind of virtual reality spaces where they do most of their day-to-day things. I still don't quite understand exactly how that works necessarily, because like the basics of like when do they shower and when do they actually eat and that sort of thing, and how much of the virtual impacts on the real physical stuff that's going on each day, I still don't exactly follow. Maybe I was slow and just missed all the cues and things, but yeah, I just remember I kept thinking, but what? So, anywho, that's the dealio in Reverie, and Arya is just a typical teenager in that dome city, and her mum is a doctor and like a super special person who kind of works with or for the government in Reverie, and Arya is very close to her mum. It's just her and her mum. Children aren't born in the quote-unquote natural way in Reverie, they're kind of created, so Arya was specifically created for her mother. Yes, so stuff happens at the beginning, and Arya is booted out of Reverie because bad things occur, and she's blamed for a crime she didn't commit, and her mum's gone missing, and all bad things, and she's thrown out of Reverie into the Death Shop, and there she meets this dude named Peregrine, who's called Perry, and he's a savage. And they form an unlikely alliance and have to work together because Perry's is now searching for his nephew, who has been taken, and that he thinks he's been taken into Reverie perhaps, but he doesn't know why, and so they have to help one another out and go on this journey together and learn to accept one another, and of course they fall in love. And yeah, for the most part I remember thinking that the pacing of this book was fairly decent. Because it starts off with a fair amount of animosity and distrust and disdain and prejudice between Arya and Perry, because neither one of them like the other. Like, the outsiders, the savages, those who live outside of the dome, tend to have a very poor opinion of those who live inside, and vice versa. So there's that kind of cultural divide that they have to get over. And just the very basics of how each one lives is very different from one another, so it is a big shock for Arya to be outside of the dome, and it's also really quite scary for her because she has been raised on the belief that once she's out there she won't be able to survive and she'll die almost right away, and there's a million different ways she can die there, and so she's really freaking out. And because you're in her head for a lot of that, because it swaps perspectives, it's like the atmosphere is created very well there, even though you as the reader know she's going to be okay, obviously, and you kind of assume that the majority of what she's been raised on has been all lies or fabrication or exaggeration to scare everyone in Reverie. You still fear for her and you still feel bad for her because she's freaking out. And that's understandable, but she's determined to make the best of things and to keep surviving after a while, and even though she can be whiny at times, but you can understand why, because, you know, it's not the comfort and the ease that she's used to, and she's so dependent on technology as well, and there's none of that outside of Reverie, so she's really displaced and confused. And Perry, I mean, I didn't really have big issues with Perry or with Aria as individual, and what I like is that you did get to know them as individual characters before they became a couple, which was mega, like, thumbs up. That's always a good thing, because I'd much rather know these two people and appreciate them, or dislike them, or whatever, have opinions on them before they come together, because that makes their coming together that much more potentially interesting or powerful, because you know who you're dealing with as individuals, and then they can be a couple. So I like that we spent time with them before anything romantic really happened, and that they spent a while trying to get to know one another. Perry was okay. At times I found him a bit, I can't even describe what it was exactly, but sometimes I'd feel a bit off around him, like I wouldn't, and I'll expand on that in a minute because there's one very specific thing that made me really uncomfortable. But something that worked highly in the favour of both characters was the fact that this novel does not suffer from disappearing family syndrome or disappearing parent syndrome, as so many YA books do, where you forget entirely about your family and your other friends and that once you meet your love interest. And, you know, it's like kind of Peter Pan short-term memory loss, and every now and then you're just like, oh yeah, parents, huh? But so much of the journey that these two undergo together is based around family members that they love. You know, Perry really wants to find his little nephew, and Aria really wants to find her mum, and that keeps motivating them throughout. And even though they, you know, come to love one another and understand one another, and they're very important to one another and stuff, it's still vital that they find these family members and protect them, make sure they're okay in that, which is really great. And it also shows the bond that Perry has with his nephew and Aria has with her mum, and their differing relationships there. So I really liked that. That was good. This may well be just me, but the thing I've taken away the most from this book was the one thing that made me very uncomfortable, and I will tell you what it is. For whatever reason, I don't think it's ever exactly explained, it's just part of the fantasy element, outsiders, the savages, have a tendency to have really heightened senses, and different people have different ones. And Perry's like an extra special one. I think there's a name for it, because he has 2 heightened senses. I forget what the other one was. Emotion? Like empathy, I think, maybe, or mind reading, or something. He can feel your... He calls it like your temper or something. He can feel your emotions, but he also has a very strong sense of smell. Very, very strong sense of smell. And after a little while Aria's been out in the outside of the dome, she gets really sick and she doesn't know what's wrong with her, and she assumes she's dying. And it's because the poor girl gets her period, and she's not well, and it's not a happy. She doesn't celebrate it. She's like disgusted and scared and in pain. But her scent suddenly becomes so much sweeter to Perry, and it starts to smell like violets. And hold on, I'll try and find the passage where it. I can't even explain why it made me feel so disgusting. Hold on. Perry closed his eyes and inhaled. Her scent had changed. The ranky dweller musk had almost gone. Her skin breathed a new scent into the air, faint but unmistakable. For the first time since he'd known her, her flesh smelled something like something he recognized, feminine and sweet. He smelled violets. Gull. And then he says to her, but this is a good thing, you can bear children. And she's like, what? What? Because they don't bear children naturally in Reverie, and this is all big news to her, and she's not happy about it. But he continues to make references throughout to her scent being really sweet whenever she's going through that, and that is the moment, kind of the turning point for him in how he perceives her, and he begins to see her as being more human, which is understandable, but in my mind still really disturbing, because he's like, oh, she's childbearing, I like what I see there, that's a childbearing woman. and he starts to see her as, you know, a viable love interest in that from that moment on, and that really, I can't, it's just me and my anti-maternal self, but that creeped me out. It reminded me of reading The Virgin Suicides, when all the boys were getting horny over the idea that at any one point one of the Lisbon sisters across the road would be having their period, and they found that really cool. I'm like, that's just creepy, guys, that's just gross. So that's my strongest memory from reading this book, was getting freaked out over Perry finding Arya's period scent alluring. In terms of fantasy elements, there's a few. I'll link the Dweeb 92's review of this book, because she does a better job than me, and she mentions how it feels like there's a bit too much of a mishmash of different fantasy and sci-fi ideas going on in this book. It didn't bother me that much. There are things you kind of think, how does that fit into this world exactly? But it wasn't too bad. I liked some of the supporting characters we met. Perry's friend Raw, in typical standard mate YA fashion, I really liked him, and I like him too because his concern is with somebody, like the welfare of someone else, and that remains his concern as well. And I also just liked his personality. There's someone that they go and see, I've totally forgotten his name, who's kind of like the, you know, Yoda, Dumbledore, Gandalf of the crew, and he's wise and older and stuff, and I like him as well. And pacing-wise, I didn't really have a problem with the book at all, and I like that we spent time with these characters as characters before they were a couple, and that's all I can remember for now. But it wasn't half bad, so I'm giving it 4 stars out of 5 for Under the Never Sky by Veronica Rossi.